And our political commentators are with us now. Neale Jones and Tim Hurdle it is today. Morning, and thanks for your time both.
Morning.
Morning.
Neale was Chief of Staff to the Labour leader Jacinda Ardern, and prior to that Chief of Staff to Andrew Little. He is the Director of Public Affairs firm Capital and was currently providing PR support for Andrew Little's campaign for Mayor of Wellington on a voluntary basis. Tim Hurdle was an advisor in previous national governments. He works in strategic communications and advisory. He's currently campaign director for Auckland Mayor Wayne Brown. Okay, let's have a look at the situation the Prime Minister finds himself in as he heads off on overseas visits to China and Europe. G7 meeting, of course, is coming up at the moment, and one suspects the discussions on the sidelines may be as significant as those on the main floor. What are you making of this geopolitical environment at the moment, Tim, as it impacts what the Prime Minister, the Foreign Minister and others need to articulate?
Well, we're seeing on our screens every night some pretty complex and dangerous conflicts in the Middle East, and his challenge is to balance our most important economic relationship with China, maintain the trade flows, confidence of the Chinese, with the increasingly challenging security environment of the world, where people are being forced to take sides. We're trying to protect and encourage our reputation as a defender of the liberal international order, which is increasingly collapsing in the face of just aggression across the world. So he has a very difficult path to try and maintain good relationships with all those countries and keep New Zealand relevant in those discussions.
Of course, this comes in the context also of people saying alliances need to shift, alliances of different kinds, discussion about how New Zealand's should be positioning itself with other neighbours in the region. It is a significant move just in the last week, which could impact the future of the AUKUS Pact and therefore any New Zealand involvement at our second tier level. What are you making of the review the United States is reportedly carrying out over that AUKUS Pact and the submarine deals, etc.?
Well, it's a pretty serious situation. The whole point of AUKUS Pillar 1 was to buy the very sophisticated, they call them the apex predator of warfare, the Virginia-class attack submarines that the Australians were going to buy second-hand off the Americans. The Americans are now saying, hey, hang on a minute, we might need these ships because things are starting to get pretty hot. Are we going to send them to you? Are we going to sell them to you? And so the entire Australian defence strategy, and frankly a heck of a lot of money, has been poured into this deal. It's now under review, but that was a deal that was looking out decades because they were also looking to build new ships in Australia, and that wasn't going to be due to happen until in the 2030s or 40s. So with that policy under review, the entire basis of Australian defence is now under review. And as our most important defence relationship, we probably have to look at what the consequences will be, because Australia, if they don't get those ships, will have to come up with a new plan, and they'll probably be looking at us to say, what can we do to help?
This is always predictable with AUKUS, though, which is that the Pentagon, its targets for the submarines the US has to have, they're about half the level of production they need to be. So the idea that Australia is going to get them, that US will say we don't have enough submarines ourselves, but we'll give some to Australia, I think it's increasingly unlikely those submarines will ever materialise. And I think it goes to show that while China is an increasing authority and threat in the region and around the globe, I think with the US, the idea that we should throw our lot in with any kind of arrangement with the US going out decades, let alone beyond next Tuesday with Donald Trump in the White House, is really suspect. The US it was an unreliable ally before the Trump administration. I think it's an increasingly unreliable ally. And even when it comes to things like Taiwan, for example, we talk about the coming threat in Taiwan. You could quite easily see a world where Donald Trump says, you know what, I'm quite happy being a big man in a world of big men in charge of big powers, and we'll just carve the world up, and I'll get Greenland and the Panama Canal, Putin can have Ukraine, and the Chinese can have Taiwan. So he'll sell them out, and I'm sure he'd sell us out in an instant. So we need to be very careful in terms of how we position ourselves with these great powers.
I wonder if it does take some of the pressure off the New Zealand government and its messaging on AUKUS, which has been a lot of wait and see, nothing to see here, nothing to report yet. And we're talking second-tier AUKUS again, right, which is what was proposed. You're wondering whether this review now takes the pressure off the New Zealand government to make decisions imminently.
Yeah, and they certainly shouldn't be making decisions around getting into AUKUS, which is, it's a military alliance aimed at containing China, and I think we should be very careful about, maintain relationships with the US, maintain our links with them, but I don't think we should be getting any deeper right now than we already are.
The messaging also over what is said... Sorry, go ahead, Tim.
I think there's quite a lot of myth about whether New Zealand gets to decide to go into Pillar 2 of AUKUS. AUKUS is very much a three-way arrangement, and there's discussions that might involve us having some engagement or collaboration in it. But I've seen material in international media which says that countries that have massive technological bases like South Korea, Canada, Japan aren't even being considered. So to think that we'd be ahead of those countries in a queue to be involved, certainly as a full partner, is just ridiculous. But you only need to see what happened with the Ukraine attack on the Russian bomber fleet to realise how much technology is driving warfare, and to think that we wouldn't try and have access to avenues to that kind of information and technology surprises me. I don't think we really want to hide down here at the bottom of the world thinking we'll be immune from it, because we can see from these situations that it will come to you if you don't have anything ready to stop it.
A lot of discussion about New Zealand's quote-unquote independent foreign policy. Interesting developments this past week or so with the decision to join the criticisms of the two Israeli politicians, which in turn drew a rebuke from the United States. And also the Prime Minister being quite direct in his commentary over the events over the last few days, the attacks on Iran, and then in response, this is the last thing the region needs is more instability. This is potentially catastrophic for the Middle East. We don't want to see that happen. So again, testing for the Prime Minister, and of course the Foreign Affairs Minister as well at the moment. A very fine line to walk again in very tense times.
Yeah, but I think the government took the right call here. We do have to be principled in our foreign policy, and I think, to Luxon and Peter's credit, they did make the principled decision there, and they shouldn't back things they know are wrong simply to curry favour.
All right, let's have a look at other matters. Satu, take your eyes off what is happening right at the moment at speed. But let's bring matters home again a little bit closer. Let's just, I guess, touch on the polls issue again. There've been three now that pretty much indicate the same thing. A very tight race between the left-right blocks, if you like, depending on which poll it was, one slightly ahead of the other, but in each instance within the margin of error. How disappointed, Tim, would National be to supply and Labour, I think, in one of the most recent polls? It might have been the Courier poll. Or will it be happy to absorb that as the cost of a very unpopular budget, really? Just delving into the question specifically about the budget. Would it be comfortable with where it landed?
Probably not. I think it would have been hoping that it could have got some bounce off it. Really, the challenge for National is where the pathway is going forward, and that will be in large part connected to the economic recovery. The power of the economy always makes always positive for incumbent governments. National's now polling below what it got at the last election. It didn't get to 40 at the last election. It was disappointed with that. So its challenge is now, how does it get momentum up to drive towards a more stronger position at the next election? And I guess the one thing that will be in its favour is some of the economic tailwinds are now coming behind it. We've got a lower interest rate environment, which always takes a while to flow through. But I guess the higher commodity prices and returns for farmers will also drive a lot of economic confidence. There's certainly a lot of evidence too that this investment boost project, anybody I talk to seems to be very interested in this investment boost policy, and certainly it is stimulating the economy, particularly if you look at some of the commentary coming out of field days. There are people opening up the checkbooks again, and that in itself will drive a lot of economic confidence. So those are the key questions for National, is how hard and how fast it can get the economy growing before the next election.
The question specifically about the budget were pretty unfavourable towards it, Neale. But again, would Labour have been hoping perhaps for a bigger reversal, with the pay equity issue, of course, lingering as well,
Yeah, definitely.
than what's been seen in this round of polls?
Yeah, I would say so. Although Labor's reasonably happy with where it is in the polling at this stage in the cycle. A lot of hope in people I talk to in Labor. I'm a little bit less hopeful. I think that while the polling shows it could go either way, I think that the fundamentals are probably on National's side, which is that, as Tim notes with the economy, as long as the projections are accurate, which is a big if, they'll be able to go to the election saying that inflation's down, interest rates are down, the economy's growing, and wages are growing. And that will, they'll be able to say, we've made some tough decisions, we've got New Zealand back on track, vote National to keep on track, and look at that clown car over there, and they'll be able to fearmonger over Te Pāti Māori and the Greens' tax policies and so forth, and Labour's tax policies. And so I think that coming up to election year, Labour does have some challenges. I think they also, they've done. Chris Hipkins done a very good job of holding the party together. They've managed to focus on, jobs, housing, health, the key issues, so they haven't got distracted. I do think the challenge they've got over the next 18 months, as well as tidying off how they're going to form a coherent coalition government, is to be able to show New Zealand how they've changed, what's different this time to last time. Because if you're trying to knock a government out after one term, after a landslide defeat, you need to show you've changed, and you need to show some new policy ideas. And
when are they going to talk tax in detail?
Well,
quite late in the piece, do you think?
No, my understanding is it'll be this year.
Right.
They'll start, and that'll be an important thing, is when they start to lay out the tax policies and what that will fund. Those two have to go together. But really, Labour needs to show they've learned some lessons from last time, and they've got some new ideas, and they can provide some hope to the electorate that everyone's miserable. People aren't too stoked about how things are going. I think the government is not popular and not liked. But Labour has to show it can be better, and you can actually trust us to deliver it. And that's the big challenge for Labour over the next 18 months.
The other thing that's coming out of this latest round of polls, some of them anyway, Tim, is cost of living had been number one voter concern. Now it is the economy in general. Now that could cut both ways for National, as you've been alluding to.
Yeah, I think that generally, if we're talking about economic issues, the National Party does well. It's moved away from talking about health, which is a pretty big win for National. Just coming back to what Neale was saying there, I think Labour's almost done. It's achieving its polling by not doing very much, by just sort of staying static. And preparing for this, I noticed, I had a look at the Labour Party website that had 3 press statements out in all of June. They haven't been a very loud opposition. And I guess the challenge they'll have in the next election is what happened to Peter Dutton, is when they came out in Australia, the opposition, and started being visible, they hadn't tested their ideas. People looked at them and said, no thanks. And I guess that's the challenge for Labour, is to stay relevant to the conversation, but also be ready for the next election. So this is where these, at this point of the cycle, oppositions are often benefiting from discomfort with the government. But the challenge is, how do they present a credible alternative that people are willing to risk their vote with?
We are at midpoint. I'm not sure where that sits in terms of voter engagement with much at all, really, other than being generally pretty, under stress, which has been the case for quite some time. What else are you looking for? Some election years start to take off pretty quickly. They can start to really become all about elections from fairly early in the year. What else are you looking for between now and then, in terms of what's going to define it?
Well, the thing that we've got this time is we've got a very clear 3-party coalition in a way we probably haven't seen for ever. And this is where we've now got this multivariate parliament where different, you saw, a contest on the National Party for the farmer vote from the ACT and New Zealand First vote. You have, if you look at the polling, Labour tends to do well when the Greens are down. The Greens do well when Labour's up. So those two are contesting on the left and on their spectrum. And then there's the spectrum challenge between who's getting the votes over the middle. So I guess what I'm looking for is who's really targeting that vote to try and change the dynamic between a centre-left or a centre-right coalition. And that requires that National and Labour to start taking votes off each other. So that will be the issue, is who's got the issues that change the middle vote or median voters' interest. And win that vote.
What do you think the issues are there about? Health, of course, it might have slipped down the list, but I don't think that that's put it out of people's minds.
Yeah, look, I think between Labor and National, it'll probably be a pretty traditional election campaign. Labor will be pushing for more spending on health. It'll be pushing for probably a broader tax base, something like a CGT. And National will be making the case for lower taxes, lower, but they would argue better directed government spending and more private investment in infrastructure. I think that's probably the shape of Labor versus National. And National, I'm sure, will run a scare campaign on tax and will marshal the minor parties' policies and pin them on Labor. I think Te Pāti Māori and ACT, who have a weird symbiotic relationship, will do all they can to make it a divisive election campaign on the Treaty of Waitangi. And I think New Zealand First will do all it can to prosecute the war on woke, and I imagine they'll probably pair off against the Greens on that. So we'll probably have, I think, a traditional election between National and Labour with culture war dominating a lot of the airwaves from the minor parties on both sides.
Let's cycle back to the Prime Minister's trip overseas, which is imminent. He's got some big meetings ahead. As we said, it's an interesting development in terms of where AUKUS is or isn't heading. That happens just before he meets President Xi of China. Also, I understand there may be expectations perhaps of a pull-aside with President Trump at the very least, if President Trump a pull-aside potentially. We've got other big meetings like the NATO Leaders Summit coming up, etc. So not clear what his itinerary is there. But what does he need to get right? Tim, again, he's a fairly new Prime Minister, he's a fairly new politician, and this is next level foreign affairs, right? What does he need to get right on this trip?
Well, I think the big advantage is being in the room for New Zealand. This is where being invited to these summits is really important, because you can actually have these bilateral discussions with key leadership. He has got to keep building those relationships so he can pick up the phone, or he's in consideration when big issues are going down, that we get a call and we're asked to join those important discussions. And I guess his key outcome here is to try and maintain the confidence that we are making progress on things like improving our security situation, but we are also staying true to our basis of protecting the international trading system and international law. So he's trying to become a useful person to be involved in these conversations, and that's really what you're trying to achieve when New Zealand Prime Minister. Be someone that's worth keeping involved, keeping in the loop, because you bring a certain degree of neutrality, I guess. Under
pressure, though, because, of course, NATO, again, the call is out now to keep ramping up that spending. New Zealand, of course, is not a formal member of NATO, but comes along as an observer pretty regularly. Most of these events, I understand.
And they're talking about 5% of GDP, so he's going to have a big question when he turns up and says, oh, well, we've got a plan to get to 2% of GDP. If they look at New Zealand's spend, there's going to be some big questions about what we've actually trying to achieve.
They're fairly highly stage managed, these events. Yeah. Neale, you just want to stick to your lines and get it right?
I agree. A lot of the work's done behind the scenes, but also as the PM, you just got to, like Tim says, be relevant. Make sure that you make those connections, because New Zealand's a small country. We're not particularly relevant to the rest of the world, and so we've got to punch above our weight. In terms of the defence spending, look, I think 5% is somewhat out of bounds of achievement for New Zealand in the short term or medium term or possibly long term, but certainly I think we do need to look at increasing our defence spending, but I think we do that on our own merits, not because we're trying to please any allies. In an increasingly unstable world, we need to better to, do a bit more to defend ourselves and help others in our region.
Okay, thank you both very much for your time. That is Neale Jones and Tim Hurdle.